This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. The summer of 1881 brought to Nevada Territory a heat that seemed to calcify the very air above the silver mining town of Aurora, a settlement perched precariously in the barren Excelsior Mountains near the California border. The town had materialized almost overnight in 1860, swelling to nearly 10,000 inhabitants, drawn by the promise of silver veins running deep beneath volcanic rock that had lain undisturbed for millennia. By 1881, many of those veins had begun to thin and fail, and the population had already commenced its inevitable decline, though the scars of ambition remained carved into the hillsides in the form of abandoned shafts and the skeletal frames of stamp mills that would never process ore again. But one structure persisted as a monument to the town's brief prosperity, dominating the eastern ridge like a silent witness to both fortune and ruin. The Vandermeer House, a mansion so disproportionate to its surroundings that travelers approaching Aurora would spot its distinctive tower long before the town itself came into view. The mansion had been commissioned in 1863 by Cornelius Vandermeer, a Dutch immigrant who had arrived in California during the gold rush of 1849 and found his true fortune not in the played-out gold fields of the Sierra foothills, but in the silver strikes that transformed western Nevada in the early 1860s. Unlike many of the mining magnates who constructed ostentatious residences in San Francisco or the boomtown of Virginia City, Vandermeer insisted on building his primary residence directly above his most productive mine, the Prosperity Shaft, which burrowed nearly 800 feet into the hillside, with lateral tunnels extending in multiple directions through rock, that geologists would later describe as dangerously unstable. The structure itself was unlike anything else in the territory, an architectural anomaly that seemed transported from the urban east and deposited incongruously in the high desert. Designed by Gideon Harwick, an architect brought west from Philadelphia at considerable expense, the mansion sprawled across nearly 12,000 square feet, with 23 rooms distributed across 3 visible floors and what construction records suggest was an extensive basement level that connected directly to the mine workings below through a system of reinforced passages. The exterior featured elaborate Victorian Gothic details that seemed almost aggressively ornate given the austere landscape. Pointed arch windows framed in carved wood, elaborate bargeboard trim painted in deep burgundy and cream that required constant maintenance in the brutal sun, decorative ironwork along the balconies, and a 4-story tower topped with an iron weather vane fashioned in the shape of a miner's pick and shovel. Local newspapers of the period described the house's completion in 1865 with a mixture of civic pride and subtle unease. The Aurora Esmeralda, the town's primary newspaper, devoted an entire front page to the mansion's formal unveiling, noting that construction had required materials shipped by freight wagon from Sacramento and San Francisco, including marble quarried in Vermont for the fireplaces, crystal chandeliers manufactured in Pittsburgh, thousands of board feet of mahogany and black walnut for the interior trim, and specialized materials whose purpose the article did not elaborate upon. What the newspaper conspicuously did not mention, but what appeared in the private correspondence of several townspeople whose letters have been preserved in various archives, was the unusually high turnover of workers during the 2-year construction period. Between 1863 and 1865, at least 47 different craftsmen worked on the project, according to payroll records discovered in a San Francisco bank archive in 1961, with many leaving abruptly and refusing to discuss their reasons for departure, even when doing so meant forfeiting wages owed. Cornelius Vandermeer himself was a figure who commanded respect but little warmth in Aurora. Born in Rotterdam in 1821 to a family involved in the shipping trade, he had arrived in America at age 28 with a background in mining engineering acquired through studies in Amsterdam and practical experience in coal mines in Belgium. He was known among Aurora's business community for his obsessive record-keeping, his absolute refusal to consume alcohol despite the social expectations of frontier mining culture, and his peculiar habit of conducting personal inspections of his mine tunnels at hours most considered unusual, sometimes descending into the prosperity shaft well after midnight and remaining underground for extended periods. Workers at the mine, in conversations recorded decades later by oral historians, whispered that their employer seemed to perceive things in the rock that others could not, that he would halt mid-inspection and tilt his head as if listening to voices or sounds carried through the stone itself, and that he would occasionally stand motionless before a particular section of tunnel wall for long minutes, staring at rock that appeared no different from any other section. In April of 1867, at age 46, Vandermeer married Josephina Crane, the 26-year-old daughter of Marcus Crane, a prosperous San Francisco merchant with interests in shipping and banking. The marriage was arranged through business connections, as was common in that era among families of means, and those who attended the ceremony at Aurora's Presbyterian Church noted in subsequent correspondence that the bride appeared notably subdued throughout the proceedings, speaking only when directly addressed and keeping her eyes downcast during the reception held at the mansion. Josephina had been educated at a finishing school in Boston and had, according to letters written by her younger sister and preserved in the California Historical Society archives, expected to marry into San Francisco's emerging social elite, not to be transported to a remote mining settlement in the Nevada desert, where the nearest genuine city was several days' travel by stage. The household staff during those early years consisted of several individuals whose names and fates would later seem significant. Wei Huang, a Chinese cook who had come to California during the gold rush and possessed considerable skill in both Chinese and American cuisine, managed the kitchen. Bridget O'Malley, an Irish immigrant who had arrived in Nevada in 1865, served as housemaid and general domestic worker. A groundskeeper of uncertain origin, known in all surviving records only as Mr. Pike, maintained the property's exterior and supervised the small vegetable garden and stable. Additionally, there was Ambrose Whitley, a private secretary originally from Boston, who managed Vandermeer's extensive correspondence and business affairs and lived in a separate cottage constructed on the property approximately 200 yards from the main house. The first documented incident that would later acquire significance occurred in October of 1867, less than 6 months after the marriage. According to a letter preserved in the Nevada Historical Society archives in Reno, written by Bridget O'Malley to her sister in Virginia City and dated October 23, 1867, unusual sounds had begun manifesting in the mansion during nighttime hours. The housemaid described hearing what she characterized as rhythmic tapping, as if someone were striking metal implements against stone in a measured pattern, emanating from somewhere deep within the structure's walls. When she mentioned this phenomenon to her employer, Vandermeer dismissed the complaint as merely the sound of ongoing work in the mine tunnels below, conducted during night shifts to take advantage of cooler temperatures, though O'Malley insisted in her letter that the sounds originated from inside the house itself rather than from beneath it, and that the pattern of the tapping seemed too deliberate to be explained by conventional mining activity. Mrs. Josephina Vandermeer appeared rarely in Aurora's limited social sphere after her arrival. The Aurora Esmeralda, which faithfully recorded the social activities of the town's prominent families, mentioned her attendance at only 3 public events during the 3-year period between 1867 and 1870, a church fundraising social in November 1867, a 4th of July celebration in 1868 where she departed early citing the heat, and a memorial service in March 1869 for 2 miners killed in a cave-in at the competing Silver Cloud mine. At each of these appearances, witnesses who later provided oral histories to researchers recalled that Mrs. Vandermeer seemed increasingly withdrawn and detached, responding to questions or greetings with monosyllabic answers and frequently appearing distracted, as if listening for sounds others could not hear. In December of 1869, Bridget O'Malley terminated her employment at the Vandermeer house without providing the customary notice period. She departed Aurora by stage to Carson City, and from there traveled to San Francisco, where she obtained a position with another household. When Ambrose Whitley, acting on his employer's instructions, wrote requesting a reference for a potential replacement housemaid, O'Malley provided only the briefest response, stating that the position had proven unsuitable to her temperament and declining to elaborate. Years later, in 1923, when she was in her late 70s and living with her daughter's family in Oakland, O'Malley spoke to a grandson who was compiling family histories. According to his notes, donated to the Bancroft Library in 1958, she stated only that there had been rooms in that house that felt fundamentally wrong in ways she could not adequately articulate, doors that should have remained permanently locked, and that Mrs. Vandermeer had begun to look like someone who had not experienced genuine sleep in months, with a hollowness around the eyes that suggested something beyond ordinary exhaustion. The domestic staff was replaced with others. A German immigrant couple, Heinrich and Greta Fischer, assumed responsibility for cooking and general housekeeping in January of 1870. They remained until May of 1871, when they too departed Aurora suddenly, leaving behind several months of possessions that they never returned to claim. A second couple was hired, then a third. The pattern repeated with disturbing consistency. New employees would be engaged, would serve for a period ranging from several months to slightly over a year, then would depart abruptly. By 1873, the turnover had become so frequent and problematic that Vandermeer began increasingly relying on day workers from town who would perform specific tasks and return to their own homes before evening, rather than maintaining a staff of live-in employees. During this same period, production levels at the Prosperity shaft began a steady decline. The rich veins of silver that had made Vandermeer's fortune were becoming progressively thinner, requiring deeper excavation into rock formations that geologists recognized as increasingly unstable. In March of 1872, a section of tunnel on the 3rd level collapsed without warning, killing 2 miners instantly. The Aurora Esmeralda reported the incident in its March 16th edition, noting that Vandermeer had personally supervised the recovery of the bodies and had paid for proper burials in the town cemetery, which represented more generosity than many mine owners would have demonstrated. What the newspaper did not report, and what did not become known until decades later, came from the diary of one of the surviving miners, Matthias Kohn, a Prussian immigrant whose grandson donated his grandfather's papers to the Mineral County Museum in 1952. In an entry dated March 14, 1872, written in German and later translated, Kohn recorded that the collapse had exposed something unexpected behind the rock face, what appeared to be a cavity or chamber that was clearly not a natural geological formation, but rather something that had been deliberately excavated at some point in the distant past and then sealed. Vandermeer had arrived at the collapse site within an hour of the incident and had ordered the area closed off immediately, before any of the miners could conduct a thorough examination of what the collapse had revealed. Kohn noted that in the uncertain illumination provided by their oil lamps, he had glimpsed what resembled carved or incised markings on the stone surfaces surrounding the cavity, symbols or pictographs that bore no resemblance to anything he had encountered in 20 years of mining experience across 3 continents. When he attempted to ask Vandermeer about this discovery later, the mine owner had responded curtly that it was merely an old exploratory shaft from an earlier, unsuccessful claim, nothing of significance, and that no further discussion was necessary or welcome. That same year, individuals living in proximity to the Vandermeer mansion began to observe changes in the property's character and in the behavior of its occupants. Albert Thorson, who owned the stamp mill that processed ore from several local mines, including Vandermeer's, and whose residence offered an unobstructed view of the mansion's distinctive tower, documented several observations in letters to his brother in Sacramento, portions of which were preserved and later archived at the California State Library. In a letter dated August 12, 1872, Thorson mentioned that lights could be observed in the tower at unusual hours, sometimes appearing to move in deliberate patterns, sometimes remaining stationary for hours at a time, well past midnight. He also noted that Mrs. Vandermeer, who had previously been occasionally visible at her second-floor windows during daylight hours, was no longer seen there, as if she had ceased to occupy the upper floors entirely or had taken to remaining in interior rooms without windows. In September of 1873, following another minor collapse and the near exhaustion of economically viable ore, the Prosperity shaft was permanently closed. Vandermeer cited the declining silver content, which had fallen below the threshold of profitability, and the increasing danger of further excavation into rock formations that his engineers deemed critically unstable. The closure left approximately 40 men without employment, adding to the growing stream of unemployed miners departing Aurora as the boom inevitably transformed into bust. Vandermeer himself, however, remained in the mansion, becoming increasingly isolated, except for the rotating group of day workers who came to perform basic maintenance on the deteriorating property. It was during this period of intensifying isolation that Ambrose Whitley, the secretary who had served Vandermeer since 1864, began to document disturbing changes in his employer's behavior and priorities. In a series of letters to a cousin in Philadelphia, portions of which were preserved in the Pennsylvania Historical Society archives and examined by researchers in the 1960s, Whitley described how Vandermeer had developed what could only be characterized as an obsession with the basement level of the mansion. The secretary was instructed to order specific materials through merchants in San Francisco and Virginia City. Heavy iron bars, which were installed to reinforce certain doors in the basement, thick canvas treated with some chemical compound, which was used to cover basement windows, and substantial quantities of salt, which struck Whitley as inexplicable for a household that was conducting minimal cooking and entertaining no guests. In a letter dated January 18, 1874, Whitley wrote to his cousin that he had been explicitly forbidden from entering the basement level under any circumstances. Vandermeer had systematically changed the locks on all doors, providing basement access, and kept the keys on his person at all times, never setting them aside even when sleeping. The secretary also noted an increasingly pervasive smell emanating from that part of the house, something he described as acrid and mineral, reminiscent of heated metal combined with sulfur compounds. When he gathered the courage to mention this olfactory phenomenon to his employer, Vandermeer had responded dismissively that it was merely fumes from the closed mine drifting upward through old ventilation shafts that connected the mine workings to the house's basement. Though Whitley observed in his letter that this explanation seemed inadequate, given that the smell had not been present before the shaft's closure, and appeared to be intensifying rather than dissipating. The relationship between Cornelius Vandermeer and his wife Josephina during this period remains largely undocumented in official records, as both individuals had become profoundly reclusive and rarely interacted with Aurora's remaining social community. However, Dr. Edmund Forrester, a physician who maintained a medical practice in Aurora from 1868 until the town's final decline in the mid-1880s, recorded several consultations with Mrs. Vandermeer in his medical journal, which was later donated to the Nevada State Archives. In June of 1874, according to an entry dated June 22nd, Dr. Forrester was summoned urgently to the mansion to examine Mrs. Vandermeer, who had apparently suffered a fall on the main staircase. The doctor noted in his journal that the patient was extremely pale, significantly underweight, in a manner suggesting chronic inadequate nutrition, and exhibited pronounced signs of severe sleep deprivation, including trembling hands, difficulty maintaining focus during conversation, and dark discoloration beneath the eyes. When he attempted to inquire about her general health and daily routine, she responded in whispers, barely audible, frequently glancing toward the doorway as if anticipating interruption or eavesdropping. Dr. Forrester prescribed a tonic intended to stimulate appetite and recommended extended rest in well-ventilated rooms with adequate sunlight, but he also noted privately in his journal that he strongly suspected the patient's deteriorating condition was as much psychological as physical in origin, though he felt it would be inappropriate to elaborate on this assessment without more extensive examination. A second consultation, recorded in Dr. Forrester's journal under the date October 9, 1874, found Mrs. Vandermeer in an even more severely deteriorated state. This time, the doctor's notes were considerably more detailed and revealing. He recorded that the patient presented with symptoms including chronic insomnia of at least several months' duration, significant weight loss continuing from the previous examination, and what he carefully described as nervous agitation manifesting in repeated behaviors such as compulsive checking of door locks, and an inability to remain in any room for extended periods without apparent cause. More concerning from the physician's perspective, Mrs. Vandermeer reported experiencing auditory phenomena that she claimed originated from within the walls of the house itself, described as scratching or digging sounds that seemed to move through the structure's interior spaces. She insisted these sounds could not be attributed to the closed mine below or any ordinary source, such as settling timbers or small animals, but rather emanated from within the actual wall cavities themselves. She also reported persistent sensations of being observed or watched, even when alone in locked rooms with no possibility of actual surveillance. Dr. Forrester prescribed laudanum in carefully measured doses for her deteriorating nerves and privately recorded his growing concern that the extreme isolation of the household, combined with what he suspected might be an unhealthy domestic situation he could not fully assess, was contributing to a progressive breakdown of the patient's mental equilibrium. By 1875, the Vandermeer mansion had acquired throughout Aurora a reputation that ensured most townspeople avoided the property unless circumstances made such avoidance impossible. Parents instructed their offspring to avoid the road that passed nearest to the property, particularly during hours approaching or following sunset. Former employees, when questioned by curious acquaintances about their experiences during their brief tenures at the house, would offer only vague and carefully nonspecific statements about the place being unsuitable or uncomfortable, declining to provide concrete details that might subject them to ridicule or disbelief. The mansion itself began to exhibit visible signs of neglect and deterioration, paint peeling in large sections on the elaborate exterior trim that had once been meticulously maintained, weeds and native desert vegetation overtaking the grounds that had previously been carefully cultivated, and several windows on the third floor remaining shuttered with closed drapes, regardless of season, as if those rooms had been permanently abandoned. In March of 1876, Ambrose Whitley tendered his resignation and departed the Vandermeer household after 12 years of service. His final letter to his Philadelphia cousin, dated March 8, 1876, and preserved in the Pennsylvania Historical Society collection, provided the most detailed and disturbing account of the circumstances that compelled his departure. He described an incident from the previous week that had fundamentally shaken his resolve to remain in his employer's service. He had been working late into the night in the ground-floor study, organizing correspondence and updating ledgers by lamplight, when past midnight he distinctly heard what he characterized as a conversation emanating from somewhere below him, clearly originating from the forbidden basement level. The voices were muffled by intervening floors and walls, but nonetheless distinct enough for him to identify one as unmistakably his employer's voice, engaged in what appeared to be dialogue or exchange with another voice he could not identify. What profoundly disturbed Whitley was not merely the late hour or the location, but rather the characteristics of the second voice, which struck him as oddly pitched and modulated, neither clearly masculine nor feminine in tone, and possessing qualities that seemed somehow wrong in ways he struggled to articulate. More unsettling still was his absolute certainty, based on his knowledge of the household's occupants and routines, that no other person was present in the house at that hour. Mrs. Vandermeer had retired to her rooms hours earlier, as had become her invariable habit, and the day workers had all departed well before sunset, as was now the strictly enforced rule. Whitley also disclosed in this final letter that he had, on 2 separate occasions in the weeks preceding his resignation, encountered his employer emerging from the basement in the early morning hours before dawn, with his clothing visibly stained with substances that appeared dark in the lamplight, and his hands wrapped in cloth, as if concealing injuries. When Whitley had offered to summon Dr. Forrester, assuming his employer had sustained some injury during nocturnal activity in the basement, Vandermeer had become uncharacteristically agitated and adamant, insisting he was perfectly well, and specifically ordering his secretary never to mention what he had witnessed to anyone, including Mrs. Vandermeer or any of the day workers. The intensity of this reaction, so contrary to Vandermeer's normally controlled demeanor, convinced Whitley that continuing in the household service posed risks he was unwilling to accept. Following Whitley's departure, no replacement secretary was engaged. Vandermeer handled his remaining business affairs exclusively through written correspondence with commercial agents in San Francisco, never traveling to the city himself and never permitting these agents to visit the property in person. Supply wagons from Aurora's merchants would deliver necessary goods to the edge of the property, typically at the point where the private road branched from the public thoroughfare, leaving items for Vandermeer to collect at his convenience. The handful of Aurora residents who encountered him during this period of increasing isolation remarked in subsequent conversations, later documented in oral histories, on his dramatically altered appearance. He had always been lean in build, but now appeared nearly skeletal, his face deeply lined in a manner inconsistent with his age, his eyes shadowed and seeming to have receded further into their sockets. Multiple witnesses also noted that he had begun to move differently, with a pronounced stoop or forward lean, as if perpetually carrying substantial but invisible weight upon his shoulders and back. Mrs. Josephina Vandermeer became even less visible to Aurora's residents than her husband during this final period. A laundress named Helen Briggs, who visited the mansion property weekly to collect soiled linens and return laundered items, later told her Methodist church group in a conversation recorded in the church's meeting minutes for 1878 that on numerous occasions she had observed Mrs. Vandermeer standing completely motionless at a third-floor window, simply staring downward toward the ground below for extended periods. When Briggs would wave or call out a greeting from her position near the service entrance, there would be no acknowledgment whatsoever, no movement or sign of recognition, as if the figure visible at the window were not truly present in any meaningful sense or was so deeply absorbed in internal experience that external stimuli failed to register. The final documented visit by an outsider to the inhabited mansion occurred in November of 1876, when Father Michael Donovan, the Catholic priest who served Aurora and the surrounding mining camps from a small church on the town's western edge, traveled to the Vandermeer property at what he understood to be the explicit request of Mrs. Vandermeer herself. According to the priest's own detailed account, later recorded in the official archives of the Diocese of Reno and examined by historians in the 1950s, he had received a brief letter in Mrs. Vandermeer's handwriting requesting that he come to hear her confession, despite the fact that she was Presbyterian by background and baptism, and had never previously shown any interest in Catholic sacraments or practices. Father Donovan arrived at the mansion on a cold afternoon in mid-November and was received at the door by Cornelius Vandermeer himself, who appeared genuinely surprised by the visit and initially attempted to turn the priest away, stating that there had been some misunderstanding and that his wife was unwell and not receiving visitors. However, upon Father Donovan producing the letter and explaining that Mrs. Vandermeer had specifically requested his presence to hear her confession, Vandermeer reluctantly relented, though he insisted with unusual emphasis on remaining present somewhere within the house during the priest's visit, ostensibly for propriety, but in a manner that suggested surveillance. The priest was conducted to a small sitting room on the second floor, its windows facing north toward the barren mountains, where Mrs. Vandermeer awaited his arrival. In his written account, Father Donovan described encountering a woman who appeared to be in her mid-40s at minimum, though he was aware from public records that she would have been only 35 years of age at that time. Her hair had gone entirely gray, a transformation that medical understanding of the era attributed to extreme shock or prolonged psychological strain, and she moved with evident difficulty and discomfort, as though each physical motion caused pain. The conversation between priest and penitent was necessarily brief and constrained by the priest's awareness of Mr. Vandermeer's presence somewhere nearby, quite possibly within earshot. Mrs. Vandermeer spoke in carefully measured terms of feeling profoundly trapped in her circumstances, of having witnessed things she could not adequately explain to anyone who had not experienced them directly, of sounds and sensations that had systematically stripped away any sense of safety or peace within what should have been her home. She did not provide specific concrete details, perhaps because she sensed or knew that her husband was indeed listening from the hallway outside the closed door, but she repeatedly asked Father Donovan a question that clearly weighed heavily upon her conscience: whether a person could receive forgiveness for remaining silent about wrongs or harms they had witnessed, but lacked the power, courage, or means to prevent or report. Father Donovan attempted to provide spiritual comfort and pastoral counsel, suggesting that she might benefit substantially from a period away from the isolated property, perhaps staying with family members in San Francisco or with her sister, who he understood lived in Sacramento. Mrs. Vandermeer responded by shaking her head slowly and stating that leaving was no longer a possibility, though she declined to elaborate on what specific factors prevented her departure, whether physical barriers, psychological constraints, or some combination of circumstances she felt unable to articulate. As the priest prepared to take his leave, Mrs. Vandermeer pressed into his hands a small notebook bound in dark cloth, asking him to keep it sealed and unread unless something were to happen to her that made its contents relevant. Father Donovan agreed to this request, though he later admitted in his written account that he had not at the time taken this request as seriously as circumstances would prove he should have, assuming it was the anxious and somewhat melodramatic request of a woman suffering from profound loneliness and psychological strain, rather than a genuine warning or plea. On the afternoon of December 3, 1876, a freight driver named Samuel Perkins, in the process of delivering supplies to a mining operation located on a property neighboring the Vandermeer estate, noticed that the mansion appeared unusually and completely dark despite the time being mid-afternoon, when at least some illumination would normally be visible. Concerned by this anomaly, given the isolation of the property and the advanced age and apparent frailty of its occupants, Perkins approached the mansion's front entrance and knocked firmly on the heavy door. Receiving no response after several minutes of repeated knocking, he tried the door handle and discovered to his surprise that the door was unlocked, simply pushing open when pressure was applied. The interior of the ground floor appeared silent and superficially undisturbed, though Perkins later testified that he immediately noticed an overpowering smell he described in his written statement as reminiscent of a butcher's establishment combined with something chemical or medicinal that he could not identify more specifically. Perkins called out several times, announcing his presence and asking if anyone required assistance, but received no response. He ascended cautiously to the second floor, where a methodical search of the rooms led him to Mrs. Vandermeer's bedroom. According to the formal coroner's report filed with Mineral County and later transferred to state archives, when the county boundaries were redrawn, he found Mrs. Josephina Vandermeer deceased in her bed, lying on her back with her arms positioned at her sides. The official cause of death was determined to be an overdose of laudanum, with the medicine bottle still present in her hand. Based on the condition of the body and the degree of rigor mortis present, the county coroner, Dr. Silas Whitmore, estimated that death had occurred approximately 2 to 3 days prior to discovery. There was no evidence of violence or struggle, no signs of forced entry to the room, and the death was officially recorded as self-administered, though whether the overdose was intentional suicide or accidental misadministration could not be definitively determined from the available evidence. Cornelius Vandermeer was not present anywhere in the house. A thorough search of all rooms on all 3 floors, conducted by Perkins and subsequently by the town constable, who was summoned immediately, found no trace of the mansion's owner. His personal effects remained undisturbed in his study, including his leather wallet containing a substantial sum in both currency and bank drafts, and his gold pocket watch, an expensive timepiece that he had been known to value highly. The basement access door was found locked from the outside, with the key inserted in the lock itself, suggesting that whoever had locked it had been on the ground floor side rather than having locked it from within the basement. Perkins and Constable Martin Hendricks initially did not descend into the basement, with both men later providing testimony that the smell emanating from beyond the locked door when they opened it slightly to investigate was so intense and nauseating that it caused immediate physical distress, including gagging and dizziness. A formal and more thorough search of the basement level was conducted 2 days later, on December 5th, by Constable Hendricks, accompanied by 3 volunteer deputies recruited from among Aurora's more robust citizens. They found a large, undivided space occupying roughly half the mansion's footprint, with walls of mortared stone and a floor of compacted earth. The basement showed evidence of having been partially finished for habitation or use, with several rooms partitioned off using rough lumber and basic carpentry. Most of these partitioned spaces contained items one would expect to find in such storage areas: obsolete mining equipment superseded by newer designs, furniture that had been replaced or fallen into disrepair, household goods no longer in regular use, and various materials related to Vandermeer's mining operations. However, one room located at the far end of the basement, in the area closest to where the basement connected to what had been the entrance to the sealed Prosperity Shaft mine tunnel, had been fitted with a door constructed of heavy iron rather than wood, hung on substantial hinges and equipped with a lock of unusual complexity. This door stood open when the search party arrived. The interior of this final room was almost entirely empty, containing no furniture or stored materials. However, the walls displayed markings that the search party found deeply disturbing and impossible to categorize satisfactorily. These markings, described in Constable Hendricks's official report as symbols or pictographic images, bore no resemblance to any writing system or decorative pattern familiar to anyone present. Some appeared to have been carved or incised into the stone walls, while others seemed to have been applied using some dark pigment or staining agent. The floor of this room showed extensive evidence of dark discoloration, particularly concentrated in the center of the space, suggesting repeated spills or applications of some liquid substance over an extended period. The overpowering smell that had initially prevented entry to the basement was strongest and most concentrated in this particular room. Samples of the stained floor material were collected in glass containers as specified in the constable's report, though no formal chemical analysis was ever conducted on these samples, which were stored in the constable's office until they disappeared during a reorganization of records sometime in the early 1880s. An additional discovery in this room, mentioned only briefly in the official report, but described in more detail in a personal letter Constable Hendricks wrote to his brother in Sacramento, was a collection of objects arranged on a stone shelf that had been carved into one wall. These included what appeared to be small bone fragments, some showing evidence of having been deliberately carved or marked with symbols, several pieces of mineral specimens that could not be immediately identified, and a leather-bound journal written in a language or cipher that Hendricks could not read. This journal was sent to the Territorial Government Office in Carson City for potential translation or analysis, but according to correspondence discovered in state archives during a 1962 research project, it was never successfully translated, and its current whereabouts are unknown, the last reference to it appearing in an inventory list dated 1879. Cornelius Vandermeer was never found, despite searches of the surrounding terrain that continued intermittently for several weeks following his wife's death. His disappearance was officially recorded as such, with the case remaining open but inactive. Speculation among Aurora's residents ranged widely. Some believed he had taken his own life in some remote location in the desert or mountains, perhaps out of grief over his wife's death or shame regarding circumstances unknown. Others theorized that he had simply fled Aurora to escape debts or obligations, though this explanation seemed inconsistent with his character, as those who knew him understood it, particularly given that he had left behind substantial assets, including cash and valuable possessions. A smaller number of residents, generally not willing to voice such thoughts publicly, wondered whether something else entirely had occurred, something connected to whatever had been transpiring in that basement room. The notebook that Mrs. Vandermeer had given to Father Donovan was eventually opened and read, though the priest delayed doing so until after the funeral and burial, uncertain whether the circumstances of her death constituted the something happening she had referenced, or whether he should continue to respect her request for confidentiality. The notebook contained entries spanning from sometime in 1870 through late November 1876, written in an increasingly deteriorated hand that progressed from neat, controlled script to nearly illegible scrawl. The entries were fragmentary rather than forming continuous narrative, often consisting of isolated sentences or brief phrases. Early entries, from 1870 and 1871, mentioned hearing sounds without identifiable sources, observing lights where no lights should be, and experiencing sensations of presence when alone. Entries from 1872 and 1873 became more specific and disturbing, referencing the basement level directly, stating that her husband had discovered something during the mine collapse of March 1872 and had brought it into the house, and expressing fear that he believed he could control or manage it, but that this belief was dangerously mistaken. Later entries became increasingly difficult to read due to deteriorating handwriting, but certain phrases were legible. References to voices, speaking languages she did not understand, to her husband spending entire nights in the basement, to smells that permeated the upper floors despite closed and locked doors, and to her growing certainty that something fundamentally wrong had taken residence in their home. The final entry, dated November 28, 1876, merely 5 days before her death, consisted of a single sentence that Father Donovan found particularly chilling. "He goes down there every night now and talks to it, and it answers him." The mansion and its contents were inventoried by court-appointed officials and subsequently put up for public auction by the territorial government, as no heirs came forward to claim the estate despite advertisements placed in newspapers throughout California and Nevada. The auction, conducted in March of 1877, attracted minimal interest given the property's reputation and the ongoing decline of Aurora as a viable community. A San Francisco investor and speculator, purchasing through an agent to avoid personal involvement, acquired the property at a price representing perhaps 1/10 of its actual construction cost. The stated intention was to convert the mansion into a boarding house for miners, or possibly a small hotel, ventures that might have been viable had Aurora's silver boom continued. However, this commercial plan was never realized. Workers hired to conduct necessary renovations and modifications to convert the private residence into commercial space quit their employment within days, with several refusing to enter the building after their first day's work. The complaints varied, but centered on what workers described as an oppressive atmosphere that made breathing difficult, sounds emerging from walls where no cavities should exist, and recurring equipment failures and accidents that made normal work impossible. Tools would disappear and reappear in different locations. Lumber, carefully stacked, would be found scattered the following morning despite the building being locked, and lamps would extinguish themselves without explanation. After the third crew abandoned the project, the San Francisco investor instructed his agent to seal the basement level permanently. This was accomplished using brick and mortar, with the basement access points not merely locked but physically walled over. The mansion changed ownership twice more between 1878 and 1882, each successive owner purchasing the property at a reduced price and each attempting some form of commercial or residential utilization. A group of businessmen from Virginia City, the second purchasers, tried to establish a private club or lodge, but this venture collapsed within months when prospective members refused to spend time in the building. The third owner, a widow from Sacramento who had inherited considerable wealth and apparently knew little of the property's history, intended to establish a finishing school for young women, but abandoned this plan after a single preliminary visit to inspect the premises, subsequently selling the property at a substantial loss without ever taking possession. By 1883, Aurora itself had entered terminal decline, the silver largely exhausted, and the population reduced to a few hundred individuals, mostly those too poor to afford relocation or too attached to their claims to abandon them. The Vandermeer mansion stood empty and increasingly derelict, its windows systematically broken by weather or human agency, its doors hanging loose or removed entirely by scavengers seeking usable materials, and the once grand structure rapidly deteriorating under the assault of desert sun, winter snows, and the relentless wind that swept across the barren hills. In 1894, what remained of the mansion was finally demolished by order of Mineral County authorities, who deemed the structure a public hazard due to its advanced state of decay and the risk of collapse. The demolition was carried out by a crew from Carson City, as no Aurora residents could be persuaded to undertake the work. The salvageable lumber, of which there was still considerable quantity, given the quality of original construction materials, was removed and sold, with the proceeds helping to offset the demolition costs. The stone foundation was left in place, gradually crumbling under the effects of weather and time. The mine entrance that had connected to the basement was permanently sealed in the early 20th century using concrete, though precise records of when this was done and who authorized it are incomplete. appearing in county records only as a line item in a budget document from approximately 1907 or 1908. A historian from the University of Nevada, Dr. Helena Cardwell, examined the Vandermeer case in 1957 as part of a broader study examining mining-era tragedies and unexplained incidents in western Nevada. Her comprehensive report, archived in the university library but never formally published due to concerns about its speculative nature, noted several elements that she found troubling and difficult to reconcile with conventional explanations. The symbols described as having been found on the walls of the locked basement room bore resemblance, according to her research, to petroglyphs documented elsewhere in Nevada, some of which archaeologists had dated to pre-Columbian periods, potentially centuries or even millennia before European arrival. The chemical analysis that was never performed on the stained floor material might have revealed whether the discoloration resulted from blood, mineral deposits, chemical compounds related to mining processes, or something else entirely. The question of what precisely Cornelius Vandermeer might have discovered in that sealed cavity exposed by the March 1872 tunnel collapse remained purely speculative, with no surviving evidence to examine. And the ultimate fate of both Vandermeer himself and whatever might have been contained in that basement room could not be determined from available documentation. Dr. Scheidt Cardwell also conducted interviews with descendants of several Aurora residents from the 1870s, reaching individuals who possessed family stories passed down through 2 or 3 generations. An elderly man named Harold Kemp, whose grandfather had been one of the constable's volunteer deputies during the 1876 basement search, told Dr. Cardwell that his grandfather had refused to discuss what he had seen in that basement for the remainder of his life, becoming visibly and profoundly distressed if the topic was raised even decades later, and that he had moved his family from Aurora to Reno within a year of that incident, citing only a desire for better opportunities, but behaving in a manner that suggested flight rather than rational career advancement. Another descendant, a woman named Margaret Sutton, reported that her great-grandmother, who had been a neighbor to the Vandermeers during the 1870s, would never walk past the site of the former mansion even decades after its demolition, and after she had moved to Carson City, insisting when questioned that some places retained permanent traces of what had occupied them and that certain ground remained fundamentally changed by what had occurred upon it. The official explanation for the tragedy at the Vandermeer house, as it exists in county records and historical summaries, remains straightforward. An isolated marriage deteriorated under the combined stresses of geographical isolation, declining economic circumstances, and possibly individual psychological instabilities, culminating in the wife's death by overdose and the husband's subsequent disappearance, presumably through suicide or flight. The anomalous details, the basement room with its unexplained markings and stains, the symbols that resembled ancient petroglyphs, the consistent pattern of staff departures, the recurring accounts from multiple independent witnesses of unusual sounds and sensations are generally attributed to the combination of superstitious thinking common in 19th century frontier communities and the natural tendency of abandoned buildings to acquire sinister reputations that become embellished through repeated telling. Yet certain documented facts resist easy incorporation into this conventional narrative. The unusual rapidity with which domestic staff consistently departed the household, abandoning secure employment in an era when such positions were highly valued. The specific pattern of Vandermeer's behavior changes following the March 1872 mine collapse, particularly his increasing obsession with the basement level and his nocturnal activities there. The physical and psychological deterioration, visible in both Cornelius and Josephina Vandermeer over a period of several years, progressing in a manner that multiple witnesses found remarkable. The unexplained symbols in the sealed basement room, which bore no resemblance to anything the investigating officials could identify. and the central question of what precisely lay behind that collapsed tunnel wall in March of 1872, and what Vandermeer might have found there and subsequently brought into his home. Some historical mysteries are not solved, but simply archived, filed away in county record offices and institutional libraries, gradually forgotten as generations pass and direct witnesses die. The Vandermeer case occupies this category. The house itself is gone, demolished more than a century ago. The mine it sat above is permanently sealed, its tunnels collapsed or flooded or simply lost to time and failing memory. The original witnesses, the staff who departed, the neighbors who observed, the officials who investigated, are all deceased, their direct testimonies reduced to fragmentary written records and oral histories filtered through multiple retellings. What remains is documentation, coroner's reports following standardized formats, property records tracking ownership changes, personal letters preserved by chance or family sentiment, and journal entries that survived when so many others did not. These fragments collectively suggest a narrative more complex and disturbing than official explanations acknowledge, but they do not and cannot provide definitive answers, only questions that echo across more than 14 decades. In Aurora today, almost nothing remains of the silver boomtown that once housed nearly 10,000 inhabitants. A few foundations constructed of stone that has weathered the desert climate, a cemetery where wind-eroded markers stand among sagebrush and greasewood, and the memory of fortunes rapidly made and more rapidly lost. The town site itself was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1961, though this designation protects only what little remains rather than any functioning community. And on the eastern ridge, where the Vandermeer house once dominated the landscape, commanding views across the valley and visible for miles, there is now only bare ground and scattered stones, indistinguishable from the surrounding desert terrain except to those who know what to look for. Local hikers and history enthusiasts who occasionally pass through the area, following faint traces of old roads or visiting the abandoned cemetery, sometimes report experiencing a sensation of unease when traversing that particular section of the ridge, a feeling of being observed, or a pressure in the atmosphere that has no rational meteorological source. These reports are typically dismissed as psychological projection, the power of suggestion working upon people who know the site's history, yet they recur with sufficient frequency to have become a minor element of local folklore. The story of the Vandermeer house remains precisely what it has been for more than a century. A documented historical tragedy containing unexplained elements, a case that achieved nominal closure through official documentation, but never achieved actual resolution, a mystery that the mere passage of time has rendered probably unanswerable. Whatever Cornelius Vandermeer discovered in the collapsed section of the Prosperity Shaft in March of 1872, whatever drove his wife Josephina to her final desperate act in December of 1876, whatever marked the walls of that sealed basement room and stained its floor, these things are known only to the desert wind that moves ceaselessly across the barren hills, and to whatever darkness still exists beneath the concrete seal that closes the old mine entrance. The official records provide facts, dates, names, basic sequences of events. But facts alone do not constitute understanding, and there are elements of this case that resist factual explanation, that suggest dimensions beyond what official investigation documented or could document, given the limitations of the era and the circumstances. Some questions once asked can never be satisfactorily answered. Some doors, once opened, can never be entirely closed again, and some places, regardless of how thoroughly they are demolished or how many years pass, retain something of what occurred within them, an imprint or echo that persists in ways that materialist philosophy struggles to accommodate. The Vandermeer case represents all of these simultaneously: an unanswered question, an open door that was never properly closed, and a place that even in its physical absence continues to affect those who encounter its story or visit its former location. Whether this represents anything beyond human psychology and the power of narrative to shape perception remains, like so much else about this case, fundamentally uncertain.